Awesome. Um, Good afternoon. I'm Ifetayo Venner, Vice President and Wastewater Service Line Leader with Arcadis, and also Vice President with the Water Environment Federation. Uh, I think you just heard quite a bit of discussion about the utility space. To add to the two conversations that we just had, I was asked to provide a little bit of an insight as to how the sector as a whole looks. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I will say, certainly as the work we've been doing at the Water Environment Federation and within Arcadis, there's not a lot of publicly available information. I'm sure that will change as everyone's really focusing on this topic. So bear that in mind, and I'll probably focus, since we just had a discussion about utilities, a little bit more on the consulting contracting side of the business. So I'm sure, hopefully, many of you at this point have heard of the Brookings Institute paper. It's been widely talked about in the last couple of years, and probably very much so because of the lack of information that they has publicly being available about what the workforce looks like. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about it. Estimated that it's about 1.7 million persons that are in the water workforce. About 20% or so of that is within the utilities, but there's a lot of water employees that support, utilities and various water functions that are outside of the utility sector, whether that be academia, whether that be within a consulting firm, in construction, and so on. It is an area where a lot of the work does not necessarily require a lot of experience. And you'll see in a little bit later why that is the case. As far as educational attainment for water workers, you'll see in the blue, water occupations tend to require a high school diploma more so than maybe the general workforce as a whole. And not as much requiring the bachelor's, master's, and postdoc degrees as maybe some overall occupations within the workforce. And that sort of ties back to a lot of the jobs don't necessarily require a lot of experience or tenure. The age range, it is a little bit similar to the overall workforce, but it tends to skew a little bit older. And a lot of you heard, I'm sure, of the silver tsunami, where there's the expectation that there a fair amount of workers, maybe half the workforce, is expected to retire within the next 10 years, or depending on whatever you see quoted, it is maybe 2 to 3 years or so older than the average for the overall workforce. One thing that was really highlighted within this within this work was that it is primarily male sector. About 15% of those of the water workforce is female, and they're certainly also shifted within certain positions. So you'll see that a large share of the secretarial, receptionist, billing, and so on within a water utility are held by female workers, but you don't necessarily see that many of them in a lot of the operations and maintenance jobs, or even within construction and so on. So that is certainly something that really stood out there. As far as racial diversity within water, when you look at this graph and you look at overall water occupations, you'll see that Black and Asian workers are underrepresented with respect to the overall population and in all occupations, whereas it shows Hispanic workers are overrepresented, but that doesn't quite tell the full story. One of the things that also came out of this research, which I think qualitatively, visually, you may see, is that especially with Black and Latinx, Hispanic workers within the sector, they tend to be congregated in some of the lower paying, lower experience job functions. Whereas once you get to jobs that require bachelor's degrees or higher, and certainly some of the more, and I use this term very, very loosely, professional jobs, they are much less so represented. And I'll talk a little bit when I start breaking out into academia and the general engineering, architecture, and construction sector, how that looks. This is from a paper that was done by folks from the Association of Environmental Engineering and Science Professors. It shows bachelor's to PhD degrees, and then the professors within academia. You'll see that about 40% of that graduating workforce, I guess, from academia is female, 40 to 45%. And that goes pretty consistent still with MS degrees, and then it drops a little bit, but not a lot for PhD degrees. Not so much, it's about the same as PhD level in terms of assistant professor and associate professor, but it certainly goes down in full professorships. But that seems to have been improving over the few years, at least with respect to female share of the graduating and teaching workforce. Looking a little bit at it by race, you'll see that the large majority of those seeking degrees, at least in environmental engineering, which tends to focus a lot to produce a lot of workers for that professional, higher paying job workforce, is primarily white, but you will see that there's a lot of folks that also, I think, has a high percentage of international population, especially within the MS and PhD degrees. Similarly, for the full professors, again, at the assistant professor level, it is not quite, it's a little bit more diverse. Once you start getting into the full professor, there's certainly a bit more work to be done there. Don't want to spend too much time on this graph. It just kind of shows over the 3 years, a little bit similar to what I had showed earlier as far as male, female within the degrees that graduate environmental engineering. And I think, civil and others are not necessarily that different. What you see here is that it hasn't necessarily changed over the last several years that they've been tracking this metric. Shifting quickly to the consulting, architecture, engineering, construction part of the sector. Again, there's not a whole lot of information. I think the individual firms do track a lot of what they have, but it's not necessarily made public. This information is from EFCG, which is a kind of they do mergers and acquisitions, and there's a lot of collaboration amongst the CEOs of a lot of these firms in the infrastructure space through this group. And they provide a lot of the information that they report for government purposes to EFCG as well. And so this was something I had gotten from 3 years ago as to what that sector of the business kind of looks like. It's about 30% female. So a little bit higher, say, than the average. At least looking within my firm, I would say that is pretty on target. But it hasn't changed a lot over the last several years. I think if you even look, that says to 2016. I think if you look to 2020, it's probably about the same. I think there's maybe been a little bit more movement of getting females into the higher levels of the organization. But as far as how many are kind of coming in, it's about the same, which a bit tracks with, in academia, where that showed 40% kind of across those several years that they tracked as well. As far as minorities, they also haven't changed a lot. I mean, I guess there was a slight dip. I would say that also is probably fairly consistent. I will say, based on what I've seen within my firm and some other firms, it is a little bit higher probably for water. This overall percentage, it's probably somewhere between 15 and 20%, depending on who you look at. I will say of that minority group, Asian workers are probably about half of that. And you'll find that Black and Latinx employees are probably about a third of what they are in the population within this number. So they're maybe hovering around like 5-6% for Hispanic and about 4-5% for Black employees within this space. one of the things that I think people are coming to realize is that reporting of just this minority, and certainly within Arcadis, is it hides some things because not all of these groups are the same, and some of them are maybe they are minority group, but they are well represented, or maybe what you would call overrepresented within this segment of the water sector with respect to where they are in the population or the workforce, and then other groups may be underrepresented within there. And so looking at that at a more nuanced level is important to make sure that you're bringing everybody along and including them and moving them up. One of the other things is, I think you will find again that while overall there may be in this, even within some of these firms, you will find that the minority groups, especially the Black and Latinx employees, are more in the lower levels of the organization, a little bit less represented once you start getting into leadership, and they may be also more into like the field side versus some of the areas that might be more considered past the leadership. So there's a lot of things to be looking in this space to help move the sector forward as well. Something else that I found interesting at the smaller, so the larger firms tend to have a higher number. Female population is a little bit around the same, not necessarily seemingly tied to the revenue of the firm, but the smaller firms tend to have a lower percentage of minority workers than some of the really large groups. The other thing, I think this points to leadership as well of both female and minority groups. It is, again, females and minority groups tend to sometimes be a little bit more skewed when compared to, other groups in some of the overhead technical areas, and less so in the project managers, engineers, which often are parts past the leadership within these groups, and certainly less represented at the higher level officer, manager, and executive than where they are within that overall workforce. And then lastly, as it goes to inclusion, their study also looked at, and they track different initiatives for inclusion that some of these firms do. Certainly, women's networks seem to be common across the board. And certainly in the last, maybe since this was done in 2017, I've seen a lot of increase in terms of having other research groups.
I don't got time for that. I was asleep.
And a lot of them have targeted mentoring programs. And many other different, they have certain training, empathy, millennial events, a lot of them have different activities, but certainly women's networks and now the, employee research or affinity groups and mentoring are probably the most common thing a lot of them have. It did show that some of the initiatives appear to increase diversity, like those that had quite a few maybe had a little bit more. I think that seems to show a little bit more on the bringing female representation more so than minority groups. That's not a huge difference related to that. I think we've talked a lot about, you can't have, if you focus on diversity without inclusion, you don't necessarily get the results, but certainly I think it goes the other way around too. Focusing just on inclusion without looking at who you have, you can't really include who you don't have, who's not there. It really is important to focus on both things as you try to improve within your organization. So that's just a little bit of a snapshot of the sector. We're talking about stakeholders, and certainly this is some of the stakeholders that will be engaged here. Any questions?
Yeah, I believe there is one question. Let me see here from Bev. By international, do you mean non-US citizens?
Yes. Well, I think it's beyond that. It's those folks who are probably on like an F1 or those kinds of visas that are from live outside of the country that have come to school, go to school within the US.
Any other question, comments? I don't see it here. Yeah, the one other question came in the chat from Dave Zombak. Does WEF have programs, plans to help educate girls in middle and high school about trade jobs?
And Bree, I think Bree's on here.
Yeah, Bree is here
So we
probably.
can
She
talk to
can-
that. I think, well, WEF has a fair amount of initiatives in terms of this, but we had last year a workforce diversity, equity, and inclusion task force that they were asked to look at and provide recommendations to our board as to what WEF could do to help improve DE&I within the water sector. So certainly they provided quite a bit of recommendations, and some of them, we're acting on, some of which are increasing awareness with respect to that in colleges, in high schools, for operator and other workforce needs. But one of the things that also came out of that was we wanted to go through a strategic planning process as well. So we now have a new permanent diversity, equity, and inclusion subcommittee, and we've hired a consultant that is helping us to develop a strategic plan, first internally within the organization, looking at ourselves, but then also moving forward. There were a lot of recommendations and things like that. How do we sort of prioritize and do that? So I would say yes, there are efforts to do that, but also efforts to help our member associations do these things. And Bree, I don't know if you want to add to that. There's a lot of efforts going on across the board. It's probably too difficult to summarize in just a short conversation.
Yeah, we there were a lot of recommendations that came out of that group, and I mean, ideally we could kind of target all of the kind of different categories that we would want to hit to help the water workforce. I think particularly with the middle and high school students, we haven't done too much targeted campaigns or anything for operation jobs there, but we do continue to do events like Waterpalooza before WEF Tech to kind of hit students at that very young age of elementary school, and also have created a lot of, or are working to create a lot of different toolkits and things like that for the member associations, like Ifetayo had said, just because for a lot of those kind of initiatives, we found that it's easier for kind of those local groups to hit them up or get directly to them before the WEF National does.
Yeah, and I think on some areas it does make sense more for the local than not. And certainly, one of the other things we did was inflow. That's less for, high school students and more for college. But also we have the career tech for folks who are in some of the job training programs as well. So we have those two tracks, and some of the member associations have been and will continue to be doing that on their level as well. And one of the things is those inflow students were also engaged with Waterpalooza and so on. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Dave also asked, maybe Dave, that will be good for the breakout we can discuss. And I agree with that. There are strong cultural norms about what constitute appropriate male versus female jobs. It seems like breaking these norms require engagement with young students. So maybe I think this is a good for in the breakout also to discuss how we define male-female job.
Yeah, and we had a lot of discussions about that. I know, I think WALA, which is the Water Agency Leaders Alliance, I guess, with maybe I think the U.S. Water Alliance had done some research looking at the different messaging that different groups respond to. So male, female, and then also the different racial groups and how they respond to some of them. They're trying to figure out how do they message to bring folks into the sector, and different groups maybe resonate with different messages differently. And so that's been some interesting work that they've been doing as well.
Great. So if it is good if you can post that reference you are referring. Is that report out or?
No, I think that's ongoing work that
Okay.
I think eventually it will provide one. I don't think one's out yet.
Okay.